January 31, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands steadied as he began photographing the aircraft before him. A pristine Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, tail number 763-12. This cannot be a standard military design. No air force in the world would produce a bomber this way. The fuselage, the gleaming, distinctive cylindrical shape that earned its Allied nickname, dominated the tropical sun. Measuring nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, the bomber rested on its tricycle landing gear like a massive cigar. The wings, spanning 25 meters, showed no external damage. The powerful engines, 14-cylinder radials, appeared intact, each producing 1,500 horsepower. This was not recovered wreckage. This was a complete operational bomber, abandoned hastily by its crew during the rapid American advance. But the discovery that seized McCoy's complete attention, the revelation that would fundamentally shift American understanding of Japanese aviation priorities, came when he climbed inside the wings through the inspection panels. The fuel tanks were utterly exposed. There was no self-sealing rubber compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, and no protective coatings whatsoever. Just thin aluminum skin, barely 2 millimeters thick, was all that separated thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy gunfire. Major McCoy, the commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, had studied dozens of downed Japanese aircraft across the Pacific theater. Yet, nothing had prepared him for the implications of this one intact bomber, recovered during the liberation of Clark Field. This aircraft exposed a design philosophy so fundamentally alien to Western military thinking that analysts would require months to grasp its full strategic consequences. The engineering rationale behind this discovery would force the reshaping of American tactical doctrine and aircraft design for the remainder of the war. Every assumption American pilots held about Japanese capabilities, about the price Japanese engineers paid for performance, and the value imperial forces placed on crew survival, was about to be systematically dismantled by the evidence contained within this single immaculate example of Japan's most vital bomber. The path to this stark revelation began 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. That morning, even as the smoke still cleared from Pearl Harbor, a formation of 82 G4M bombers and 26 older G3M bombers lifted off from their bases in Formosa. Their primary objective? Clark Field itself, the main American air base in the Philippines. The assault achieved total tactical surprise. Arriving precisely at 12:35 p.m., the Japanese formation flew at 20,000 feet, safely out of range of American anti-aircraft batteries. The first wave, 27 bombers strong, saturated Clark Field's runways and infrastructure with 636 bombs. Immediately following, Zero fighters descended to treetop level, systematically destroying every aircraft that had survived the initial bombing run. Of the 17 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were instantly destroyed. Virtually every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to burning wreckage. In just 45 minutes, the vast majority of American air power in the Philippines had been eliminated. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few American pilots who survived the initial onslaught, observed the Japanese formation retreat north from his bomb shelter. He later noted in his combat report, "What stunned me was their approach. Perfect formation, untouchable altitude. The fighters then finished us off." The Betty bombers had departed untouched. The handful of American fighters that finally managed to take off arrived moments too late, finding only empty sky. The Japanese had successfully demonstrated the bomber's extraordinary reach, striking from bases 460 miles away, a feat no equivalent American bomber could match at that stage of the war. The Betty's first year of service would prove devastatingly effective. On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the Clark Field raid, 26 G4M bombers joined with older G3M Nell bombers to attack Force Z, the powerful British naval task force centered around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The attack commenced around 12:20 p.m. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated, low-level waves, executing their torpedo runs with a precision that shocked British observers. The Betty bombers were armed with Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms and carrying a 205-kilogram warhead. These torpedoes were engineered for shallow water operation, designed to strike ships even near coastal regions. The torpedo attacks concentrated on the two capital ships with deadly accuracy. The Prince of Wales, a 43,000-ton battleship representing the Royal Navy's newest generation, sustained at least 6 torpedo hits, along with damage from high-altitude level bombers. Massive underwater explosions tore open the ship's hull, and the flooding quickly overwhelmed damage control efforts. The battleship began listing severely. The Repulse, a World War I-era battlecruiser that had been modernized, absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while desperately attempting evasive maneuvers. Though the ship's anti-aircraft fire claimed several Japanese planes, it could not stop the coordinated torpedo strikes from finding their marks. The cumulative damage proved instantly fatal. Both capital ships capsized and sank within a couple of hours of the initial assault. Prince of Wales sank around 1:20 p.m. Repulse followed 13 minutes later. A total of 841 British sailors perished, with survivors rescued by escorting destroyers. The engagement, from first detection to final sinking, lasted less than 2 hours. For the first time in naval history, actively defended capital ships had been sunk in the open sea solely by coordinated air power. The G4M Betty bomber had proven what naval theorists had long debated. British naval dominance in Asian waters was shattered in just 90 minutes. Across the Pacific theater throughout early 1942, American and Allied pilots encountered Betty bombers in nearly every major confrontation. The aircraft appeared to operate with complete freedom, striking targets at ranges that defied Western aviation standards. They struck Darwin, Australia, operating from bases 1,500 miles away, a capability far beyond any Allied bomber at the time. They attacked Port Moresby by crossing New Guinea's daunting mountain ranges, maintaining relentless pressure on Allied positions. They launched strikes against Guadalcanal from Rabaul, covering a distance of over 600 miles, projecting Japanese air power across immense stretches of ocean. The Betty's vast operational range provided Japanese forces with a strategic flexibility that Allied commanders struggled to neutralize. American fighters, often based at forward staging points, simply lacked the fuel range to intercept Betty bombers departing from their distant home bases. Allied airfields routinely came under attack from Japanese bases that were themselves safe beyond the range of Allied counterstrike capability. This bomber asymmetry meant Japanese forces could initiate attacks at will, while Allied forces struggled desperately to retaliate effectively. This overwhelming advantage defined the first 6 months of the war. Betty bombers were central to virtually every Japanese offensive operation across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They struck targets in the Philippines, Malaya, the Netherlands, East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, providing essential support for naval operations throughout the vast theater. They performed critical reconnaissance missions that exceeded the operational ceiling of any Allied aircraft. The Betty became the quintessential symbol of the sheer reach and destructive effectiveness of Japanese air power. However, this advantage was entirely contingent upon limited Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could achieve surprise, when they could operate at high altitude outside anti-aircraft range, and when they could deliver their ordnance before fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly potent. These conditions prevailed throughout the first half of 1942, when Allied air strength was limited and thinly dispersed. But by mid-1942, the tactical situation began its inevitable change. As American fighter strength grew, Wildcats transitioning to the far more capable Hellcats and Corsairs, and as pilot training improved and tactical doctrine evolved, Betty crews began to report alarming, unacceptable losses. The critical shift became undeniable on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul with orders to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation near Savo Island. In the resulting engagement, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 Japanese airmen perished in what remains the single worst G4M loss during the entire campaign. American fighter pilots consistently reported the same observation across every dogfight. The Betty would erupt into flames after minimal hits. Just 2 or 3 rounds placed anywhere along the fuselage or wings could produce catastrophic results. The aircraft quickly acquired grim nicknames that spread rapidly through American squadrons: Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo. All these were mocking references to the Betty's terrifying propensity to blossom into a fireball from battle damage. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal, commanding VF-17 flying F-4U Corsairs, the Betty's reputation had completely transformed. Blackburn later reported, "The first time we engaged a Betty formation, we were stunned by how easily they fell. Hit them anywhere, and they'd explode. We actively hunted them, recognizing them as one of the most vulnerable targets in the Pacific skies." But the true, fundamental extent of the Betty's vulnerability, the deliberate engineering decisions that rendered such catastrophic losses inevitable, would not be fully understood until American forces began capturing intact examples for rigorous, detailed examination. The first significant intelligence breakthrough occurred in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, technical air intelligence units found Betty bombers with various levels of damage. Initial inspections confirmed pilot reports. The fuel tanks had zero protection. Aeronautical engineers with the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, conducted the first detailed analysis. The wing access panels exposed fuel cells with no protective measures. Thin aluminum construction, no self-sealing rubber compound, no protective coating, and no fire suppression systems. Multiple Betty bombers examined at Buna showed identical characteristics. This was not battle damage or a field modification. This was standard Japanese design philosophy. The implications were staggering. American bombers by 1942 universally incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress had featured them from the B-17C model onward. The B-24 Liberator had them from the XB-24B prototype. Even fighter aircraft like the P-38 and P-47 featured protected fuel systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks utilized a layered rubber compound designed to swell upon contact with fuel when punctured by bullets or shell fragments, effectively sealing the hole and preventing catastrophic fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight to the aircraft, but military doctrine considered this weight penalty essential and non-negotiable for crew survival. Yet, here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in the thousands, operating across the entire Pacific theater with fuel tanks that offered literally zero protection. The weight saved by eliminating self-sealing systems, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment was instantly obvious. But the resulting cost in crew lives was equally apparent in the loss statistics that mounted with every air engagement. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 provided the most comprehensive technical analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks meticulously dismantling and documenting every system. Their final report, classified secret, and circulated to all Allied air forces, detailed specifications that conclusively explained both the Betty's extraordinary capabilities and its catastrophic vulnerabilities. The G4M Model 1 specifications revealed an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for range and speed. It had an empty weight of 6,741 kilograms, remarkably light for a bomber of its size. The maximum takeoff weight was 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity was 4,180 liters, distributed across 8 unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing, positioned in the wing's center section where they were most exposed to combat damage. Its top speed was 428 kilometers per hour, or approximately 265 miles per hour. Crucially, its maximum range was 6,034 kilometers, exceeding 3,700 miles. Service ceiling was 8,500 meters. Crew complement consisted of 7 members. The fuel system design was particularly illuminating. The 8 tanks were arranged along the wing's longitudinal axis, near where the wing met the fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of the wing structure, but it also positioned the tanks directly in the path of any enemy fire targeting the aircraft's vital center. Any attack from the side or below would inevitably strike fuel tanks. The thin aluminum construction offered no resistance. The absence of self-sealing compounds guaranteed that even small-caliber punctures would lead to continuous fuel leakage. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by eliminating the protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. This weight savings translated directly into the additional fuel capacity and extended range that the Japanese Navy demanded. But the corresponding increase in vulnerability was equally calculable. Combat reports consistently showed that Betty bombers hit anywhere in the wing area exploded with near certainty. The unprotected tanks created what engineers termed a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed the loss of the entire aircraft. These numbers tell the story of design choices made in September 1937, when the Imperial Japanese Navy issued the requirements that defined the G4M's entire existence. They demanded a top speed of 398 kilometers per hour, a cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, and a breathtaking range of 4,222 kilometers unloaded, or 3,700 kilometers, carrying 800 kilograms of ordnance. These requirements were a direct reflection of Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. Japan's planned empire stretched across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy desperately needed bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond the reach of carrier-based aircraft. Bombers that could operate from remote land bases to support naval operations across the entire theater. Existing Japanese bombers fell far short. The G3M bomber then in service had a maximum range of about 3,000 kilometers. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could strike targets at the distances Japanese planners envisioned. The Navy's mandate was strategic, calculated based on the distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future Pacific conflict. 460 miles from Formosa to the Philippines, 600 miles from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, thousands of miles from the Japanese home islands to potential targets. The bomber that could meet these requirements would give Japan a strategic reach no other nation possessed. However, the requirements were also based on assumptions about future warfare that proved disastrously wrong. Japanese planners assumed that surprise and initiative would sufficiently protect the long-range bombers. They assumed enemy fighter opposition would be constrained by both range and numbers. Most critically, they assumed the war would be decided quickly, before Allied industrial capacity could generate an overwhelming force. Every single assumption was ultimately proven false. The man tasked with achieving this technical impossibility was Kairo Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany, absorbing key European aeronautical principles before returning to Japan. He understood immediately that meeting the Navy's specifications would necessitate compromises that Western air forces would never sanction. Honjo's team meticulously analyzed every aspect of bomber design, creating stringent weight budgets for every component. They realized that to achieve the required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. 4,780 liters of fuel meant approximately 3,800 kilograms of fuel weight at full load. To achieve the required speed with this fuel load, the empty weight of the aircraft had to be minimal. Every single kilogram added to the empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These two core requirements existed in fundamental opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating for crew and vital systems would add hundreds of kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks would add substantial weight via the rubber compounds. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would simply make achieving the required performance impossible. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its entire service life. Protection would be sacrificed entirely for performance. The fuel tanks would be constructed of unprotected aluminum with no self-sealing compounds, no armor plating around fuel cells, and only minimal fire suppression equipment. Every kilogram saved would be invested directly into fuel capacity, range, and achieving the Navy's demanding performance specifications. This decision was not taken lightly. Honjo and his team calculated the vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew that combat damage to the wings would almost certainly prove catastrophic. But they also concluded that the Navy's operational requirements could not be fulfilled any other way, with the technology available at the time. The choice was between an aircraft that met the performance specifications but carried inherent vulnerabilities, or an aircraft that failed the mission requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met or exceeded every single performance requirement the Navy had specified. Speed and range both surpassed initial projections. The bomber entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber, with initial production models, designated G4M Model 1, reaching operational units by April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service, forming the backbone of Japanese land-based air power. The Betty's combat debut demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities under the specific conditions of early 1942. When opposition was limited, when surprise was achieved, and when operating beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its extreme range allowed strikes from bases the Allies considered safe. Its speed permitted rapid penetration and exit from target areas. Its payload delivered meaningful damage. However, these early advantages rested entirely on the assumption that Betty formations would face minimal opposition. The moment American fighters' strength grew, the moment interception became a routine expectation, the moment sustained air combat became inevitable. Every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for the bomber's crew.